So what's going on in Romania? There was this guy who won the first round of the elections, but he was too friendly with Russia, and so NATO moves in and decides to build the biggest NATO base in the world in Romania because they need to protect Romania. This has something to do with the old contours of the Soviet Union. I hope everybody understands that Putin would love to rebuild the old Soviet empire, right? And that means capturing Eastern Europe again. Eastern Europeans are Slavic people. Most of them can kind of understand some Russian. For example, Bulgarian and Polish and Ukrainian are very similar languages to the Russian. Don't tell them that because everybody's offended. But okay, I'm not siding with the Russians. I just want to understand what's going on. So let's take a little step back. There was a guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was working for the National Security Council for the White House in the USA decades ago. And he wrote these books called Strategic Vision and the Grand Chessboard. And if you read these books, you know exactly what NATO is doing. NATO wants to break up Russia probably into three nations, say Siberia, Middle Russia, and the Western European Russia. And then to do, namely, to isolate China and then force China to be the West's powerhouse, our industry, basically. You remember when the Western world shipped all of its industry to the East, like the outsourcing and the offshoring? Everybody wanted to go to China and build their factories there, and then the United States was going to be an idea company. We had all the ideas, the good ideas. Like when you buy your Apple iPhone, what does it say? Right? Designed in California and made in Taiwan, right? Or made in China. So that's what they want to do. That's what the Western elites want to do. Now I sometimes question, like, who's really in charge of the USA? And if you look at people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, look at Anthony Blinken, look at Victoria Nuland, or Robert Kagan, her husband. Robert Kagan was the architect of the war on terror and the war in Iraq, right, after the 9/11 debacle. Victoria Nuland herself was briefly in charge of the war in Ukraine until she kind of just quit because she felt she couldn't win. It was taking too long. Maybe she wasn't patient enough, right? But if you want to find out who's really in charge of the USA, who's really running the show, look at who are the bosses of Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland, who tell them what to do. Then you find the real leaders of the US. It's got nothing to do with the presidency or the White House. That's just for show. Okay, but I live in Europe. So if if Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, he wants to capture Eastern Europe. And if NATO doesn't want that, that basically means Poland is going to be another battlefield, just as it had been in World War I and World War II. Poland, because of its location, will always be the center of war. Whenever Russia and Europe have a conflict, the battle will be fought in Europe and Ukraine. So, my point is, Ukraine down, Poland is next, Sweden is next, right? And there will be a struggle for the EU and for the USA to control Eastern Europe, because the Eastern Europeans, although they are receiving a lot of money from Western Europe, right? They are like net recipients of EU funds. The USA still needs Eastern European consumers, especially if they plan to flood those countries with Indians and Arabs and Nigerians and so on, because that's what's going to happen next, right? They're going to get diversity, right? Because if you want to stay part of the EU, you're going to have to brown yourself a little bit, right? That's because the US just wants more consumers so they can sell more Starbucks and more Nike and more Amazon movies and so on and so forth. It's all about capturing the markets, really, in the end. It's just about money. It's just about money. We're all serving the billionaires now. Like it or not, as long as dollars keep buying weapons, NATO will keep bombing people. They will keep bombing anybody who doesn't want to obey. So you had this election in Georgia. It's the country south of Russia, near Azerbaijan. And they also had these elections where obviously Russia does not want Georgia to become the second front after Ukraine. And Russia doesn't want, say, South Korea or Japan to become the third front to attack Russia from the east. But that's exactly what's happening, right? Why do you think Japan is starting to open its borders to welcome so many migrants from India and Vietnam and even from Kurdistan? What are Kurdistani doing in Japan? Why are they there? That's such an odd mix. But the reason is when you want to send Japanese men to die in a war fighting Russia, you're going to need other men to replace the men you've killed, right? If you want to keep the economy running, for example. And that means what NATO really is, NATO is a malak. Notice that in The Lord of the Rings you have the character Gollum, but if you pronounce the name in reverse, Gollum Malak. So NATO is a malak that does not give a damn about the quality of people. They just want to have most money and most power. And the way to achieve this is to use diversity, mass immigration, and inclusion and so on to welcome the masses into the Western system so that Nigerians are going to buy Nike and not some Chinese brand, right? It seems to be working, except not really. As Africans already know, Chinese brands, Chinese car brands are most popular in Africa right now. The West is losing the African market and therefore cannot afford to lose the Eastern European market. NATO is going to spend all the money it has and all the people it can throw at it to try to win the war against Russia, because they have to destroy Russia so they can isolate China. If they fail to do so, the US empire will simply collapse, and Europe will not survive that unscathed. Europe will then become basically a battle zone where every man will be ordered to fight to the death, really. And that's where I come in. I am foreseeing all this nonsense. I obviously don't want Europe to go down in a ball of fire. I want Europeans to start understanding that we are still in charge of our own decisions and our own future, right? There are always other possibilities. Now, even if we lost 2/3 of our population due to this World War III nonsense, the remainers, the survivors, those left behind after whatever conflict happens, they will still have skills and intelligence and creative drives. They will still have the ability and the possibility, right, to turn Europe into a sort of phoenix that rises from the ashes. And I think that is Europe's ultimate goal. I believe it was Oswald Spengler who wrote this in his book, The Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. He mentioned that although he had not heard of any civilization that had managed to overcome its collapse, that it should not be impossible for a civilization to jump its own shadow and prevent that collapse and then rise again. And this is exactly what Europe is going to do, because Europe is the Christian continent, the Christian people. And in Christianity, as you know, when Christ dies, he becomes a god. And when Europe collapses in this ultimate war, Europe alone will rise above all others.